Anishinangi miniko sema, chiganoninan. Manito, Hatsukana gaye, wapanong, shawanong ningabi anong, kiwetinong. Kimama inan gaye migwech, nindina. Migwech gaye, nindinag. Kagipimatasyo at meusha. Wito kaushinam, minik kenipimatasiyang.
This story is Gakina-awiiya, or We Are All Related, about our relationship to the environment. Binesikwe, Nindigenikaz, Makwa, Indo Dam. Winona LaDuke from the White Earth Reservation.
Recalling some of the stories I had heard was the very long migration of our people over God knows how long, a half a millennia, maybe longer. During that time, there were teachings and there were instructions and there were failings. One of the prophecies was that you'll know where to stop when you find where the food grows on water. And that, of course, we all come to know now as wild rice.
Apaji batene danu di bajmonan ande ga bonje ayayang kakinago debwe magadun bejike we geche mewejo jiba dagoshanawad geche mukamana ima jige geche gaming gi iskwa zagaswe diwad gi ane ijawag inakei ningabi anu gi ane odan de bewiwag manetu bawajikanan geget ga ijame kwamawad wisenewin ni tawaging ni bikang iye inakunagewin giwin na mawag ni zwaching da sinun gibichiwanan ima mikanako minising anishnabe ga ane ijawa jawanum inakei minawa ni jo gibichiwan ima animaki wabu midashawe bawajigan e konising gibichiwin nungum gajinakateg Detroit River. Gibichiwag, Wabino Wikweyang, Ima, Lake Michigan. Midaski aje ejawad, ki wetino, ga aje wabindamawad, bawajigan. Misa Oma, Newing, Gibichiwin, Manitoulin Island. Iane Gibichiwag Ima, Bawatigung, ga ane eje, ga Kijawang, Ima, Lake Huron. Ima, Bawatigung, ga Jinikateg, Sault Ste. Marie. Misa Oma, Naning Gibichiwining. Giwetanong Wikwewang, Ima Gichigaming, Anen Nidash, Shawanong Wikwewang, Ijawag. Ga Eje Gibichiwad Ima, Manitou Minising, Minawa, Wabanda Nawa, Manitou Bawajigan. Misa Owe, Ningotwase Gibichiwin. Midashima, Gi Eje Nagishku Datiwad, Manitou Mikanako Minising. Gagi Baba Ayawad. Mi Oma Ejinakateg Madeline Island, Nongum.
The Native people have a relationship with the Creator, and that is the relationship with the environment, the creation. The Creator is all one. We look at the four directions around us, east, south, west, north. They represent the different cycles of life, spring, summer, autumn, winter. Then they represent also the cycles of the year, the cycles of our life that we have are, when we're born, become young men, young women, middle-aged and elders. We look at our Earth Mother. She provides the food, the clothing, the shelter, and our medicines. And we give her, thanks for providing those things. When our time is finished here, we will go back with our Earth Mother and become one with her. So our relationship to the Earth, the environment that is around us, is a close relationship, and we should be looking at that relationship all the time and remembering all the time that we are part of it and are going to be one with it again one day.
And that Earth is a mother, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and the Great Lakes region area. And the water, and the rivers, That's like the lifeblood, and that's her blood veins that are flowing through her. And that's the unique relationship that we have with the water, the air, and everything that's in that relationship, all living things. And one of our relationships and our responsibilities is to take care of the earth as we would take care of our grandmothers or grandfathers.
From the earth, we get life, and we need to respect that, and that's how we were raised. One of the things too, my dad used to always tell us, if you take anything from the earth, you have to give something back. And he said, by giving something back, he said, you can take care of it, you can cherish it, you can love it.
The Anishinaabe Ojibwe survive for generations in the harsh northern Great Lakes climate, subsisting from season to season in a balanced relationship with our Mother Earth. This changed radically in the mid-1600s. The French and later the British entered the region from the east, seeking the animal pelts that were in high demand in Europe. They brought with them metal tools, fabric, blankets, beads, and alcohol, among other things which were new to our people. Over a period of time, the Europeans drew the Ojibwe into trade relationships and established forts to conduct this commerce. We became increasingly dependent on these trade goods as they altered our seasonal life cycle to trap more furs.
So there was a lust suddenly to feed the market, and it encouraged families, of course, to move inland off of Lake Superior to risk their lives and the lives of their families. It acculturated the Indians to a point that they couldn't survive without the trade goods.
At the same time came missionaries. The missionaries attempted to convert the Indians to their own religious beliefs. The impact is a tremendous assault on tribal religion, a tremendous assault on tribal culture, and a tremendous assault on the tribal economic way of life, the traditional way of life.
This one elder from Canada was talking about his great-great-grandfather during the fur trade. He says this one man was going out on his trap line. He had to go up a big hill, and when he got to the top of the hill, he heard somebody like crying noises. So he says, I went to look to see where that noise was coming from. When he got to where that noise was coming from, that crying noise, there was a little man, and right away he knew that was not a human being. He knew it was a spirit. He says, why are you crying? He says, why are you feeling bad? And he said, it's you people. He says, we watch you, we're trying to take care of you, but you don't listen to us anymore. He said, you used to do ceremonies, to do offerings, and this is what we used to get. And you don't do that anymore, so we don't have nothing. Tobacco, we don't have any more tobacco, and we're hungry. The food that you used to offer during the ceremonies was the food that we live on and thrive on. The way that is being introduced to you today is changing your way of life that was given to you. Gagib miminigu is in Anishinaabe bimadiziwin. Gagib miminigu is in the life that was given to you. You are leaving behind. You are no longer following. We're trying to watch you, guide you, but you don't listen no more. You're too busy with that other stuff that's making you crazy.
After the Revolutionary War, the new American government wanted to acquire land from our tribes for settlement. And in 1787, the Constitution included a provision of treaty making as the supreme law of the land.
The United States Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land.
One of the very first secretaries of war, a man by the name of Henry Knox, said in letters to George Washington that if we do not deal with the tribes through treaty making, we will shed American blood, we will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the United States will have great difficulty.
I am clear in my opinion that policy and economy point very strongly to the expediency of being upon good terms with the Indians and the propriety of purchasing their lands in preference to attempting to drive them by force of arms out of their country.
With an eye towards the coveted Northwest Territory in present-day Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, the young American government adopted the Northwest Ordinance, which clearly defined the government-to-government relationship with our tribes.
The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent, and in their property, rights, and liberty, they never shall be invaded or disturbed, unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress.
When you look at the Northwest Ordinance and you look at the language of just consent and you look at the Constitution, it spells out what could be viewed as kind of a humanitarian approach to dealing with the tribes. But in reality, when you look at the individuals who carried out those policies, from George Washington through Thomas Jefferson, through John Quincy Adams, and up to Andrew Jackson, what you find is that these are realists. These are people who are trying to acquire land, purchase Indian title, so to speak, and to make that area open for expansion to white settlement.
To promote this disposition to exchange lands, we shall push our trading houses and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a cession of lands.
His idea was to get the Indians in debt, and the Indians would not be able to get out of debt, and therefore he would force their hands. So it became a very vicious cycle for which the Indians never got out of.
The first people to feel the pressure by the American government to acquire their land were the Anishinaabe Ojibwe living in Michigan. They signed the first treaty with the young American government at Greenville in 1795.
From that treaty forward, every treaty that the tribes made decreased their land base, and the 1807 treaty ceded much of what's southeastern Michigan. It reserved small parcels of land and the tribe's right to continue hunting and fishing and gathering in the region. The next large treaty that they signed was the Treaty of 1819, which ceded the northeastern portion of the lower peninsula of Michigan and preserved the right to hunt, fish, and gather in the lands. Those two treaties were the ones that opened the land for survey, for settlement, and actually Americans began coming in to their territories.
At this point, northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota represent the greatest stand of timber anywhere in the United States. And it was just there for the taking. Government agents, of course, did what they first had to do according to the policy of the time. And that was to first recognize titles of the land belonging to the individual tribes. And then through a series of cession treaties later, and piece by piece lop off those sectors of land to create avenue for territoryhood for the individual states, Wisconsin first, eventually Minnesota, with the ultimate goal of establishing these regions as states. The big one at Prairie du Chien divvied up the entire region under the pretense that they were recognizing these lands that existed between the lakes and the rivers as belonging to the individual tribes. They were told simply that they owned the land between River X, River Y, and River Z. What does this mean? They responded, owning the land. Can we own our mother? And this would be a common response that you would hear, or you would hear this echoed throughout the United States. What does this mean? How can I own my mother? Land was there as a gift. The origin stories tell all of the history and the heritage of humankind and its relationship with the earth. To own your mother is abhorrent, and they could not understand this in their first encounter with the American policy at Prairie du Chien in 1825.
I think the most significant difference between non-Indian and Indian Americans and before Americans, English, French, Spanish, others thought in terms of private property, owning the land, possessing the land, deed entitled to the land. These were things that were extremely important to them. And then you have the clash of culture, clash of understanding.
When Americans began coming into the territories, life was inalterably changed from everything that had gone on for the preceding 150 years. The territorial government, led by Governor Lewis Cass, wanted the Saginaw Chippewas gone, and they wanted their title extinguished to everything so that there would be no hindrance to expanding statehood and American citizenship into the rich areas of the Saginaw River. In 1836, the United States negotiated a treaty with the people who had reservations in the 1807 treaty area, ceding those reservations and agreeing to move west of the Mississippi River. The Saginaw Chippewas in the 1819 area ceded their reservations as well. And for the period of years between 1836 and 1855, the Saginaw Chippewas were landless.
Wisconsin becomes a territory in the middle 1830s, and the United States is interested in acquiring land primarily for the purpose of cutting down trees and using the timber in the vast settlements that are occurring in the Great Lakes region. In the negotiations in 1837, the territorial governor was very anxious to acquire the land, to purchase the land, and not to lease the land, but to make sure the United States had the rights, the contractual rights to the land.
They negotiated at Fort Snelling in 1837 with the understanding that the United States only wanted to take the trees, only wanted to scrape off the top of the land and use the pine trees, the big pine trees. They wanted to lease the land, and that was their understanding through the first 7 days of the negotiation.
What allowed the treaty to be negotiated was the understanding that arose during the treaty-making process, that the Indians had the right to hunt, fish, and gather, what attorneys call usufructuary rights. The United States, on the other hand, put in the phrase, "at the pleasure of the President." This phrase gave the United States government the option to terminate these rights at some point in the future.
The headmen of the Ojibwe wanted to know what that meant during the pleasure of the President of the United States. Only after the headmen insisted that the treaty commissioner define what it meant during the pleasure of the President, he finally said in English, "It means as long as you behave yourself and you live in peace with your white neighbors." That's what that means. Then they were satisfied.
In 1837, the United States acquired a huge area for pine, for timber, for lumber that helped in terms of development of cities in the Great Lakes region. In 1842, the copper and the mineral reserves that were acquired made the Great Lakes region, the Lake Superior region, one of the leading producers in the world, and that went on well into the end of the 19th century. There were also waterways, lakes, rivers, streams, later power sites that would be developed on these various locations. So the United States acquired zillions, if there's such a word, of board feet of timber, of lumber as a result. So the 1837, 1842 treaties brought a tremendous wealth and had secured a boundary line for itself. The Ojibways received very little. They were promised money that was to be paid to them as an annuity over 20 years. It talked about certain goods to be provided for them. If you take the 1837 treaty and add 20 years, and then you have a situation where during the American Civil War, when that period was still over, the Ojibwe still had not received all of their money. Members of their tribes have enlisted on the part to defend the United States of America in the Civil War. Even though they are not citizens of the United States, even though they have money which is due to them, they have enlisted and served in the military, and their money has still not been paid. In fact, as late as the 1950s, the full debt of the United States to the Ojibwe people had not been paid in full.
When that treaty was written, I thought it was for the good of my people. You have explained it and we understand it, but it has not been fulfilled, and we bow our heads and are quiet. The money is absorbed in claims. Our schoolmasters have clothed themselves out of our money, and our white chiefs say they will remedy it, but as yet, we see nothing but promises, no remedy.
The United States government took our land using a policy called removal. The plan to remove the Ojibwe from Michigan and Wisconsin to land west of the Mississippi was masterminded by Minnesota Territorial Governor Alexander Ramsey and Indian agent John Watrous, who wanted to quicken the pace towards statehood by attracting settlers to the territory.
In order to get more people to settle here, we have to have an economy, and the only way to get an economy operating at the time was to look and see where the federal government was spending its money. While the federal government was spending its money as a result of treaty payments or annuity payments. The sort of scheme that evolved from that was that people from Wisconsin would be removed to Minnesota, and the payments then from the federal government would be made in Minnesota.
Territorial Governor Ramsey influenced politicians in Washington, D.C., and President Zachary Taylor issued an executive order in 1850 calling for the removal of the Ojibwe to Minnesota Territory. He based his order on the 1837 and 1842 treaty phrase, during the pleasure of the president.
So there are no poor relations in Michigan or Wisconsin between Ojibwe people and non-Indian people. That is what Ojibwe people could not understand. How could the United States do this?
Zachary Taylor simply took a clause out of the treaty of 37, which mentioned during the pleasure of the President of the United States. It was his right, according to what he read. Agent John Watrous, who was the BIA agent for the Lake Superior bands, conspired. He conspired with Alexander Ramsey, who was the territorial governor at St. Paul, to force the Chippewas to remove by moving the annuity payments.
He did this late in the year, the thought being that if they came during the winter to get their annuity payments, they might be literally caught there. The winter might prevent them from returning. The government could effect their removal as a fait accompli. They were already there, they'd gotten them there, they were sort of trapped, and they could keep them there. Large numbers of people make the long trek from whether it's Michigan or Wisconsin to Sandy Lake. They arrive there. They find that provisions are not adequate, facilities are not adequate. As a result of that combination of factors, infectious disease plagues their temporary settlement as they're waiting for the annuity payments to arrive.
And so you have this encampment of 4,000 tribal members waiting through all of November. There's an estimate of about 130 people that had died at Sandy Lake waiting for the distribution. And those people ended up being buried at Sandy Lake in a mass grave. Finally getting a distribution on December 2nd of supplies and annuities. After the distribution occurred, and on the long trip back east, at another 230 to 250 people died, and they either died because they were old, or they were sick. There was dysentery, there was smallpox epidemic that occurred while at Sandy Lake, and then they made this long walk back through the snow back to their home territories.
I saw evidences of a terrible calamity everywhere. All over the cleared land, graves were to be seen in every direction, for miles distant from Sandy Lake. They were to be found in the woods, too. Some were interred by their friends on their way home. So alarming was the mortality that the Indians could not bury their dead.
When you look at the death toll both at Sandy Lake and you look at the death toll on the way home, several hundred Ojibwe people lost their lives in a very miserable set of circumstances, which have historically been called the Wisconsin Death March.
I think that was probably the point at which possibility for warfare was the greatest. There was, I think, without a doubt, a consensus by tribal people here that they were not going to leave, period.
Agent Watros and Territorial Governor Ramsey had as their goal the trapping of the Ojibwe people so that they would not return. They failed in that goal. Many Ojibwe people died, both at Sandy Lake and on the way back. But the net result was the Michigan and Wisconsin Ojibwe people did return to their homes. They had no intention of a permanent relocation to Minnesota.
This horrible event resulted in an immediate outcry of objection from all sorts of people, not only from tribal members, but traders and interpreters and missionaries.
We believe we express the conviction of the entire population of the Lake Superior country in regarding this removal as uncalled for by the best interests of the government, the whites, or the Indians.
The Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Commissioner Leah, reported that there was a tremendous volume of such anti-removal kinds of correspondence. And as a result of this tremendous volume, he issued a suspension of the removal.
In a last-ditch effort, they decided to send another delegation in 1852 to Washington. The president at that time was Fillmore. Chief Buffalo was asked again to be principal spokesperson of the delegation.
Buffalo returns from his trip to Washington, D.C., elated. He believes that the President of the United States, Millard Fillmore, has given him a commitment that the Ojibwe people will not have to remove. And in fact, the Ojibwe people look at the negotiation 2 years later at La Pointe of the treaty in 1854, which establishes permanent reservations in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan as proof of two things. Number one, that Millard Fillmore kept his promise, and number two, that the removal order is gone, it's dead. The negotiation in 1854 of a treaty which called for the creation of reservations in the Great Lakes region for the Ojibwe people was viewed as a major turning point, was viewed as a formal recognition from the United States of America of the right not only for the bands of Ojibwe people to continue to hunt and fish and gather, but it was also the recognition of the right for them to have a permanent presence, a homeland, in areas that were traditionally areas in which they lived. This was a very significant event.
The 1854 treaty established the Gakina-awiiya Reservation in Michigan, along with the Grand Portage and Fond du Lac reservations in Minnesota. Also, the Red Cliff, Bad River, Lac-Courte-Oreille, and Lac du Flambeau reservations were established in Wisconsin. 1 year later, Leech Lake and Mille Lacs reservations were created in Minnesota. By 1867, 5 more reservations were established in Michigan and Minnesota: Boyce Fort, White Earth, Red Lake, Saginaw, and Bay Mills. In Wisconsin, however, the St. Croix and Mole Lake reservations would not be officially established until 1938. And in Michigan, the Grand Traverse, Lac-Vieux-Desert, and Sault Ste. Marie reservations were not created until the 1970s and 1980s. In exchange for these permanent reservations and the continued right to hunt, fish, and gather on ceded territory, we relinquished millions of acres of land to the United States.
Allotments was really a function of the United States government's concept to try to break down the overall concept of tribalism. And the idea was to privatize the ownership of land to individuals, where culturally and historically tribal people viewed land as lack of ownership, that it was a territory that you could utilize and no one really owned it.
It is clear that the best movement the government can make to subserve the interest of these Indians is to allot their lands and to dispose of the surplus at an early day. The presence of tribal property will tend to perpetuate the tribal influence, which is retrogressive.
The whole Allotment Act was a total failure. The only real advantage was that the United States acquired about half of the tribal lands, because essentially they allotted to tribal members smaller amounts of land than what the tribe as a whole owned, as a result creating surplus land, and the surplus land then was open to public settlement. It was initiated in the 1880s under something called the Dawes Act, and then in Minnesota we had even a more refined version of that called the Nelson Act.
So when they set the process up, there were so many acres per head of household, so many acres per spouse, so many acres for children still living in the home, and so many acres for an individual living outside the home, 18 years or older. And individual Indians were asked to go choose their parcel. And they had 4 years to do this process. A lot of them did, and a lot of them did not.
My folks are from the Sandy Lake area, and they moved to Isle, and from Isle we moved here. But even over there, the atrocities that they took their allotments, and they charged my grandparents' allotments with state tax, and they lost it to state tax, which is totally illegal. But that's lost forever, and that's just another thing that the government, the state government, or the federal government did. They taxed it, so when you didn't pay your tax, they took the land, which is illegal. There's nothing you can do about it now because all the claim years are gone.
The net effect of the allotment policy in the late 19th century, not only in Wisconsin, but across the entire United States, was to take 100 million acres of Indian land, nearly 100 million acres of Indian land, and to convert it to white ownership. The impact of allotment was to devastate the reservations, to take some of the choice land that existed on reservations and to turn it over to white ownership. By allowing Indian tribally owned lands to become subject to private ownership, it meant that whites could buy that land, that whites could, through honorable and not so honorable means, acquire land from Indian people. And what happens is many reservations, and that's true in almost every state, many reservations are sort of checkerboarded. There's Indian-owned land and non-Indian-owned land, literally side by side.
People were forced off our land into small refugee housing settlements, I would call them, and then plagues and epidemics swept through. By the 1930s, half our population was off reservation, refugees. The consequence of that on our community is devastating. Loss of cultural continuity. Songs. Who do you sing those songs to, tell those stories to, as your people disappear or dissipate? Further and further away.
Being severely restricted to relatively small tracts of land made it impossible for our people to survive without hunting and gathering off the reservation.
At the turn of the century, Michigan Indians had even tried farming. When the farm economy collapsed, there was no other alternative. They hunted, they fished, they trapped. The state of Michigan began arresting Indians for hunting, fishing, and trapping in the 1920s. And from the 1920s on through the 1950s, people would complain. They would say, we have a right, it's in this treaty. One tribe that I worked with actually had a published version of the treaties made with all of the Indian tribes. And whenever somebody would be arrested, they had one man appointed to carry that book to the judge, and the book is worn where he ran his fingers across the hunting and fishing clause of the 1836 treaty.
Tourism was a growing industry from the early 1900s onward in the Great Lakes region.
As this effort of bringing tourists into the North Country occurred, the State Department of Conservation began to attempt to curtail hunting and fishing and gathering. Not only did they curtail what the Indians were doing off the reservation, but even sometimes what was going on the reservation.
Saw this deer, so my husband shot at it. He went out in the woods to get it, and all of a sudden I looked in the back and I saw this car coming with a red light. I don't know what I was thinking of, but I thought state trooper was the thought that came to my mind. And I pulled out and I left my husband there. I got down the road and I thought, what am I doing? So I turned around and I went back, and it was a game warden, and he had my husband. And he was trying to take his gun away from him. And we only had one gun, you know, and we used that for hunting and getting food for our family. And my husband told him, no, you're not taking my gun. And the game warden said, well, just let me hold it. And my husband said, no, this is mine, I need it, and you're not taking it.
Swept up in the momentum of the 1960s civil rights movement, a new generation of Oshkosh and Anishinaabe renewed our connection to the land and began openly asserting our treaty rights.
In the 1970s, Bay Mills was a federally recognized tribe, and the chairman of that tribe tested the issue of hunting and fishing in the federal courts, and that was the beginning of U.S. v. Michigan, where the United States agreed with the tribes that, yes, we have a treaty with these people, yes, this right's reserved, and in that 1976 case, the United States courts resolved that the tribes retained the right to fish in Lake Michigan and Lake Superior.
As the Michigan Treaty case made its way through the courts, our communities in Wisconsin were asserting their reserved hunting and fishing rights as well.
Those two young men from the Coudray, the Tribble brothers, saying, geez, maybe Uncle was right all along. And so off they went. They went across the imaginary line on the Coudray Reservation. Half was on, half was off. Called in ENR and said they're going fishing. They got there. DNR said, you can't. They said, yes, we can. Pulled a treaty out of their back pocket, got arrested, and as they say, the rest is history.
The Tribble brothers case went to the Wisconsin Federal District Court, and in 1978, Judge James Doyle ruled against the tribe. The Ojibwe then turned to the U.S. Court of Appeals, which in 1983 reversed the federal court's decision and reaffirmed rights reserved in treaties to hunt, fish, and gather on ceded territory. This ruling became known as the Voigt decision, named after Wisconsin DNR Secretary Lester Voigt.
So this was a tremendous decision on behalf of the tribes. And the tribes were very quick to protect that and to demonstrate that they were going to hunt and to spearfish off reservation.
The next day, the war began down in Wisconsin, launched by the state of Wisconsin, DNR, which said the only thing left in northern Wisconsin will be water skiing once the Chippewa are done taking all the fish and deer and trees and God knows what else. And from that almost decade-long battle led by the state of Wisconsin, creating an atmosphere of hate and fear, many sports fishing groups, believing the propaganda of the state, really were fearful that what the state was telling them was going to be true. Well, in the end, the facts bore out absolutely the opposite, but during that time, many people were very concerned. Many resort owners, small businesses were very concerned. And in that atmosphere, there was a latent racism amongst many people, and much of that was anti-Indian, so that was allowed to really surface openly.
We were put on hit lists, fired on every night, run off the roads. I can remember when I was on Butternut Lake, and that particular night was a night that we thought we'd never all come home. The hate for Indian people just was like a black cloud at that particular boat landing. We told all our people to, stay confined, not to go out by themselves. And we told them put their tobacco down. And I walked out way on the end of the ship point, and I put my tobacco down. And it was just like a wind came up, and I could hear this voice, This was my grandmother's voice. And she said to, just like we're sitting here, and you get to know those, you don't forget those. And she says, "Don't worry, my boy." That's what she used to call us, my boy. She says, "Don't worry, things are going to be okay." But it was fortunate that our people never got killed. But I believe in heart, the fear, the flashbacks that we get are still with us.
Coming with the right was the responsibility to then protect those same resources. And in order to protect those resources, you had to develop an infrastructure because the right is not an individual right. It's not a right of me as an Indian person to go out and take whatever I want. The beneficiary of the right is actually the tribe. And along with that right comes the responsibility of developing regulations for tribal members' exercise of that right. And the foremost principle of developing those regulations is to protect the resources.
The sky is falling, the Chicken Little doom and gloom people all said that the resources were all going to be decimated by the tribes. And in fact, the tribes have taken a very small percentage of every resource that they've taken.
The Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission was formed and was comprised of 11 sovereign tribal governments in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The Commission's purpose is to regulate and protect treaty rights and cooperate in the management of the natural resources in ceded territory.
Today we had some nets set for our fall lake trout assessment and put a tag in it, and by the amount of recaptures we get back, we can give a population estimate for the area.
The population has maintained a stable level of abundance, if not increased in some areas. Wisconsin, too, around the Possel Islands, for instance, population has increased since the treaty rights were implemented. The reason Glyphwick does this area is because we have several member tribes that are fishing the area. In fact, this fall assessment, we are collecting a number of fish for contaminant analysis, and it's part of a large grant through the Administration for Native Americans.
Many other tribal organizations work with member Ojibwe tribes, such as the Chippewa-Odawa Treaty Fishery Management Authority and the 1854 Treaty Authority for off-reservation hunting, fishing, and gathering. Individual tribes also manage their own reservation and ceded territory resources. These organizations and departments operate resource management programs, establish and enforce hunting, fishing, and gathering codes for tribal members, conduct research in the Great Lakes region, and provide educational programs in cooperation with state and federal agencies.
We received calls from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Forest Service, wanting to know if they could have access to our information, because it was something that no one agency had in one place. For example, wild rice. We're doing studies on contaminants in wild rice. No federal agency has done that, and they all like the idea. So they all want to know if they can have that information from us when we get it done. And we share it back and forth.
The result of the presence of tribes in this area, the development of their capability, their professional biologists and their capability to contribute, has actually turned out to be not only a treaty right for tribal governments, but a treaty right for non-Indians in the sense that it's being used to protect the entire environment.
Despite 15 years of successful resource management and regulation in Michigan and Wisconsin, it was necessary for the Mille Lacs Band and Fond du Lac Band to go to court to continue to hunt, fish, and gather on ceded territory. Though lower courts in Minnesota affirmed these rights, the United States Supreme Court decided to hear the case. The outcome would affect all previous court rulings for the other Ojibwe as well. One of the key arguments of the state of Minnesota was that these rights were revoked when Zachary Taylor ordered the removal of all Ojibwe to Sandy Lake, based on the 1837 Treaty Clause, during the pleasure of the President. Once again, we showed our resolve and joined together in support of the Mille Lacs Band case.
And we felt that we needed to follow up because of the things that happened, in the past in Wisconsin, the struggle that we went through as Indian people, that we felt that that need not be to take place in the Minnesota area because there's already too much hurt in Indian country. And the tribes stayed unified and followed the key of the Mille Lacs Band. We were given direction in what we had to do.
We had our ceremonies. We've asked the Great Spirit to guide us, and we offered our tobacco. In fact, we had 3 of our band members that ran from Lac du Flambeau to Washington, D.C. before the Supreme Court heard our case. It was 1,000 miles, and they prayed for the justices.
We as tribal leaders made a major commitment to do what we had to do, and that was to support the Wabanin run to the east again.
The justices need to take a look at the long history of rights between the Anishinaabe people and the United States of America, and take a look at the United States Constitution that states that treaties are the supreme law of the land. And I think if they can reach that conclusion and that understanding, then I feel confident that we will prevail in this case.
Quote, after an examination of the historical record, we conclude the Chippewa retain the rights guaranteed to them under the 1837 treaty. Those are the words of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. She wrote the opinion in today's Supreme Court ruling that permits members of 8 Chippewa bands to harvest fish and game under their own regulations in territories they gave to the U.S. government in 1837.
What is it then which caused us to win? I say to you that it was the will of the band.
To have the Supreme Court of the United States say, these are your valid rights, I think that physically, mentally, emotionally is a really important concept. It says, yes, you are on the right. That is the path. That was the correct information you received. To really have that acknowledged, I think, really strengthens the ability of tribal people to stay on the path, to understand their culture, to live their traditions, and to know that their grandparents and their grandparents were right.
In honor of our grandparents, in honor of the outcome of the December 2nd Supreme Court hearing, and in honor of our ancestors who died at Sandy Lake because they resolved never to leave this land, a ceremony for healing and thanks took place.
Today,
December 2nd of 2000, 150 years later from December 2nd of 1850, when Ojibwe people from the east started on their trek back home after trying to receive their annuities here. Early in October, they arrived here and they were put on a waterlogged section of land and given rotten provisions that led to their deaths. And so we are dedicating and commemorating this memorial to remember that event. And then we're also having a symbolic run, a spiritual run, called the Mekwenda-Goziwug Run, which means remember them. And so this memorial and the run are ways of remembering those events.
We belong to this land. And so it is about how you retain your relationship to that. Now the challenge and the reality is that private property is sacred. He who holds the Waasa-Inaabidaa, he who holds the title, the paper, gets to decide what happens on that land. There is a direct relationship between ownership of land and stewardship of land. But the fact is that the laws in the United States are man's laws. And the man's laws are made largely for the interests of man, you know, not for the interests of the wolf, not for the interest of the buffalo, not for the interest of the Indian.
I think today that we're sort of been looked at as the canary, as the miner used the canary. That if Indian people go, then so goes this earth. Because we've used our treaty rights to hold back the Holocaust of destruction to the environment.
On our reservations, in our communities, we have people who are deeply connected to the spiritual values and live those values and help one another and practice our ceremonies and respect the ways of the land and our relationship with our mother. And there's enough of those people to carry on the value system.
They talk about this as the time of the people of the seventh fire, the time when our people will go back and not go back into the past, but they say that this is the time, those prophecies say that this is the time when the people will go and pick up things that they thought were lost or discarded along the path. We'll pick up those things, the Ashki and Anishinaabe. That is the process in which we are engaged in our community, with which I'm privileged to be involved. That process of recovery of land, recovery of self, recovery of who we are as Anishinaabe people. Return to our fires, return to our drums, return to our practices, and revitalize those things.
Waasa-Inaabidaa, Gakina-awiiya, we do kawa Anishinaabidaa, midashkaya geta Ojibwe moa, Waasa-Inaabidaa, Gakina-awiiya, we do kawa Anishinaabidaa, midashkaya